Myrrh oil did not become valuable because it changed. It became valuable because the systems around it stopped working without it. For centuries, this resin moved quietly through trade routes, rituals, and medicine without ever being framed as luxury. It wasn't packaged to impress. It wasn't positioned as rare. It simply existed inside systems that understood slowness, scarcity, and limits. Then those systems began to collapse. And when they did, materials like myrrh didn't evolve into something new, they were reinterpreted by a world that suddenly needed them to mean more than they ever had before. Myrrh oil did not become valuable because it changed. It became valuable because the systems around it stopped working without it. For centuries, this resin moved quietly through trade routes, rituals, and medicine without ever being framed as luxury. It wasn't packaged to impress. It wasn't positioned as rare. It simply existed inside systems that understood slowness, scarcity, and limits. In ancient regions where myrrh was harvested, its presence was tied to necessity rather than status. It traveled through dry climates, was carried across long distances, and passed through hands that valued durability over perfection. Variation in quality wasn't considered a flaw. It was an expected outcome of working with natural systems that didn't operate on demand. The oil extracted from this resin was part of survival, ceremony, and continuity, not part of a market built on promises. At the time, materials like myrrh were not isolated and repackaged for aesthetic appeal. They belonged to cycles that were slow, seasonal, and resistant to control. People understood that certain substances could not be rushed without losing their integrity. There was no urgency to make them appear more powerful than they were. They served their purpose without needing narrative. But systems change long before people notice. Trade routes shifted. Extraction methods evolved. Supply chains expanded and then tightened again. What once moved slowly began to move under pressure. What once existed locally began to circulate globally. And when materials begin to travel through faster systems, they are forced to take on new meanings. Myrrh did not suddenly become more effective. It became more visible. And visibility inside modern systems creates reinterpretation. A substance that once existed within ritual and necessity now had to exist within packaging, branding, and comparison. It had to be measured, standardized, and positioned. The oil didn't change its nature. The context that handled it did. As industrial systems expanded, materials that could not be easily replicated became symbols. Scarcity began to be reframed as exclusivity. Slowness became rarity. Difficulty of extraction became narrative value. What once limited distribution now increased perceived importance. This shift did not happen because myrrh evolved into something new. It happened because the surrounding systems began to prioritize materials that resisted mass production. At the same time, consumer perception changed. Modern audiences rarely encounter substances within their original context. They encounter them through finished products. Bottles. Labels. Controlled formulations. When myrrh appears in this environment, it carries with it the weight of its history, but also the expectations of modern performance. It must now justify its presence in a system that demands consistency, speed, and visible results. This creates tension. Natural materials are not designed for perfect uniformity. Their strength often comes from variability in time. But modern systems reward predictability. So myrrh exists in a space where its original nature must be preserved enough to remain authentic, yet controlled enough to remain usable within industrial frameworks. This balance is not stable. It is negotiated continuously. The story of myrrh oil is not a story of transformation. It is a story of reinterpretation. When slow systems dominated, its role was practical and embedded in routine. When fast systems emerged, its role shifted towards symbolism and differentiation. It became something that represented continuity in a world that increasingly values speed. And anything that represents continuity begins to carry weight. What makes this shift subtle is that it happens gradually. There is no moment where material announces its new position. Instead, perception accumulates. Stories accumulate. Associations accumulate. Over time, a substance that once moved quietly through necessity becomes framed as something that carries depth, history, and resistance to standardization. Modern supply chains continue to shape how materials like myrrh are understood. Extraction techniques become more controlled. Distribution becomes more selective. Packaging becomes more deliberate. None of these changes alter the fundamental nature of the resin, but they alter how it is perceived by the systems that handle it and by the audiences that encounter it. The result is a material that exists in two realities at once. In one reality, it remains what it always was, a resin shaped by climate, geography, and time. In another reality, it becomes a symbol inside a market that assigns value through narrative and positioning. These realities overlap but do not fully merge. And that gap between what something is and what it is perceived to be is where its modern significance emerges. Understanding this distinction changes how we see materials like myrrh. Instead of asking what the oil does, it becomes more revealing to ask what systems required it to become visible in the way it is today. Instead of asking when it became valuable, it becomes more accurate to ask when the systems around it began to treat it as if it needed to be. Because myrrh did not evolve into luxury. Luxury systems evolved to need materials that could not be easily replaced. And when a system begins to depend on something that resists replication, it assigns that material a different kind of meaning. The oil did not become rare. The environment around it became less capable of functioning without it. And once that shift happens, perception follows. Quietly. Gradually. Without announcement. Until something that once moved unnoticed begins to carry a presence that feels deliberate, even when nothing about its nature has actually changed.